So this is a buck that 2 years ago I actually had quite a few encounters with while I was hunting. He was a 2-year-old then and only had 4 points. And you can see on the video that he's kind of skinny. He doesn't have big antlers, but you can really see his body is skinny. He looks like he's got long legs and is a nice 2-year-old buck. Not something I was looking at, so every single encounter I had, and I think it was 4 or 5 times I saw him while on stand, I gave him a pass every time, hoping that down the road he would get older and bigger. And then the year after that, which would have been last year, I didn't get any pictures of him. I never saw him, never got pictures of him, really did not know if he was still around or not. But then this year, on July 11th, he shows up in velvet. Now, the interesting thing about this picture is that it's in a completely different part of the property than when I was seeing him 2 years earlier. Now, generally, that's not going to be a big issue. Deer move around quite a bit. But on this particular property, there's a big ravine that runs through it. And it's not very often that we get bucks that'll go from one side to the other. It does happen, but it doesn't happen very often. I'm guessing maybe 2 to 3% of bucks will move from one side of the property to the other.
Right.
Now, being that it was a full year removed from when I had seen him, that's not really surprising that deer can show up lots of different places. But just something to keep in mind that the east side of this property and the west side of this property generally don't have a lot of deer moving between the two. Not that they can't, it just generally doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So then the next 2 pictures are actually just the next day. They're actually just a couple hours later. So you can see that this buck is in velvet in July, which is when we would expect him to be in velvet. And he's now 2 years later, much bigger, but only a 6 point. So in 2 years, he went from a 4 point to a 6 point. That's not exactly great antler growth, but some deer just don't put up a lot of points. But he definitely put up a lot more antler in the mass that he has. And his body looks a lot bigger too. So then the next time we get a picture of this buck is on October 8th. So from July 12th to October 8th, we didn't know where he was. Now the October pictures tell us a couple things. First, you can see he's not in velvet anymore. So he shed his velvet. Usually they'll shed the first week of September, give or take a week. So start of September to mid-September, sometime in there, they'll shed. And then typically a lot of the bucks will move at that time too. They'll actually switch their home ranges. I always figure about half of the bucks move. So all the bucks I get up until September, half of them I'm not going to see anymore. But then we get new bucks that come in. So it's a good sign that this guy was one of the ones that stayed around. We didn't get a ton of pictures of him in that transition time, but he's back here in October. And then the other thing we can see is that from the previous picture, he has broken his brow tines.
Right.
So at some point, probably after velvet shed, because generally if they do it before velvet, the antlers come out a little different. They don't necessarily break, they kind of fold over, and funky things can happen. And they generally won't push on each other very much until they're out of velvet. So sometime between mid-September and October 8th, he got into a scuffle with either another buck or pushed on a tree too hard and broke both brow tines. Then we get him the exact same spot October 14th. So now at this point, we can pretty much guess he's sticking around for the season. We've got him twice in October, a week apart. It's a pretty good sign he's going to be one of the bucks that's running around that we're going to be chasing all season. Mm-hmm. So at this point is where we can kind of start coming up with a plan how to go after a buck like this. Now, he's not obviously the only buck we were going after at this time, but he's certainly on the list as he is now definitely 4 years old, and he is what we would consider a mature buck. At 3 years old, a buck is still putting a lot of the nutrients it takes into its skeletal system. At 4 years old, the skeleton's done growing, and all the nutrients they're taking in are going into the antlers. So the antlers really can take a big jump from that year 3 to that year 4. So at 4 years old, he's definitely mature, and certainly Zach being your first buck, more than happy that you got a shot at him.
Yeah.
I mean, a mature buck for your first one, that's pretty good. So then the next two videos we get are in the same area, and this is the time, in that mid-October time, is when I switched cameras to video mode. And this is really something that kind of gets overlooked, but it's important because a lot of times this is where you can see how bucks are behaving. A still picture of a buck doesn't necessarily tell you whether he's still just feeding in an area, if he's just traveling through an area, cruising for does, maybe he's chasing a doe. A lot of times if they're chasing does, you'll get a picture of the doe, but not the buck following. So if your trail cameras have video capabilities, usually about mid-October, because I was trying to be ahead of the curve, so that's probably a week early, but that's about the time I switch him over to video. So now we've got video of him, and you can tell he's not really feeding. He's out moving. He's not quite, nose to the ground looking for does, but he's not just feeding. He's moving around a little bit. And then the big thing happens. Really one of the main reasons why Zach was able to be successful is that this buck moved. Where he's been up to now is not a spot we hunt very often. The way the wind works there, we can't hunt it on most winds. It takes very specific east winds for us to be able to hunt there, so it's not really a spot we get to hunt very often. This buck then made a journey across that big ravine we were talking about and ended up on the other side of the property where we hunt quite a bit. Mm-hmm. That's one of those things that all the skills, Zach, that you put into killing that buck, that luck of him moving had to happen too.
Right.
He had to make that move to be in the area where then your skill can take over. So then we get video of him on the other side of the property on October 19th. So we know between October 14th and October 19th, he made that move. So that's a pretty good indication, because this is not the territory move that happens in September. This is a looking for does move. Where he wasn't finding does. So what he's doing is making travels away from that spot looking for does. And now he ends up in another spot where there are does. And we know there's does there. Mm-hmm. We've all seen that. Actually, that's near where, Zach, where you saw the does earlier.
Yeah.
So we know there's does on that side of the property. So now he ends up where the does are. This is a good indication that the rut is really starting to ramp up. And they're starting to at least go through some seeking activities. Not necessarily chasing yet, because it's still a little early for the does to be ready, but he's definitely out looking for does. And then on the next video we get is October 27th, so 8 days later, and now we can see some of that actual rutting behavior. We're not really inferring that he's looking for does now. Now we can see he's at a licking branch, actually depositing scent on that branch. So now we really know they're starting to hit scrapes. They're really looking for does. And this is where kind of the hunting strategy starts playing in, because once we can tell that bucks are on scrapes, we need to start focusing around scrapes. Not 100%, but it's, a general good idea. Now the problem is, you'll notice up until now, all those pictures are still at night.
Right.
So it's getting close. It's probably not quite there yet. If, let's say, that video was in the middle of the day, we would know we need to be hunting right now. Everything's going now. We're still a couple days off from the best hunting, but we know it's getting close because we're getting that info. We know he's depositing scent and looking for does. So all this is starting to come together to where we know he's going to be very active in the daylight very soon. So that's very important info to get if you can, so you know when and how and where to be in the woods. So now we've got the next day, we get another picture of him. Now this is another good indication that he's starting to move more. We're getting more frequent sightings of him. He's moving around more and more. Still at night, but he's moving around more. All we need now is that movement to transfer from nighttime to daytime, and then he's very killable. But you also notice he does a little scraping activity here. Mm-hmm. He doesn't hit the licking branch, but he does scrape a little and then pees on his tarsal glands, on his back legs.
Right.
So that's another scent deposit that he's going through. just another sign that things are really starting to ramp up. So now we get to November 3rd. Zach, probably a day you won't forget anytime soon.
No.
And we get a mid-morning video of this buck. And the first thing you see is that there's a doe in the foreground. And you can see him in the background watching her. And you can also hear him doing what we would consider to be tending grunts. Now, this is not the normal communication grunt, just general, I'm a deer, you're a deer type thing. This is, you're my doe. This is the sound I make so that everybody knows that. It's a lot deeper and it's more intermittent. It kind of...
It's like choppy.
Yeah, it's choppy. It's not a consistent grunt. It's choppy little grunts, real deep, and we would consider those tending grunts. So now at the time, we did not have this video before we went out that evening.
Right.
But if we did, we would know we need to be on stand right now. So then you see the doe moves off and he makes another scrape, and I'm guessing he follows that doe wherever she's going. So now we know there are does in heat, ready to be bred. Bucks are moving around. So we really know that November 3rd, things were rocking. It was a great day to be in the woods. Not having known this video was out there, but we did anticipate it being a great day. And actually all three of us went hunting that night.
Yep.
Yeah.
I kind of took a detour to a different part of the property, and you guys were in that general area. And then, Zach, I'll let you kind of describe what happens that evening right after we got that video.
Yeah, so we were out in the woods, and now looking at this video, I think it's the same doe that I saw later that evening, but probably around an hour after we got out there. What did we get out there, about like 3 o'clock?
Yeah.
Probably about 4 o'clock. I see a doe come by, and then right behind it, there's a buck, and I can't tell how big it is, how many points it has. It's too far away for me to tell. And I was just watching them cruise through. They were there for probably about 20 minutes, and they went off, and I couldn't see them anymore. And then probably about 30 minutes later, they come back up the trail by the stand that I was in and back into the woods from the food plot. And they were too far away for me to get a shot on with the bow. And then they went out again, straight back. And then I grunted after they left just to see if I could get the buck to come back. 20 minutes later, the doe comes in. And the doe peels off about 50 yards away from the stand and goes into the food plot. And the buck just comes straight at the stand. Probably to about 10 yards away from the base of the tree, lined up the shot, and just hope for the best.